Hello, sewing people of the internet. I wanted to make an easy, simple video for you, so today I'm going to talk about the very easy to discuss topic of sewing machine needles. So most of you will probably realize I'm being facetious here. I've gotten several requests recently to broach this topic, and I did some research, Googling stuff, and over the years I've looked into this topic. And even now, there's just not a great source of information that's consistent and clear, to me anyway, covering the topic of sewing machine needles. So this video is probably not going to be that either, but I'll do the best I can to explain what I think you need to know as a general seamster doing, lots of varied sewing tasks, not necessarily specializing in one particular thing. So there's a ton of confusion about sewing machine needles, and just to illustrate that first, I want to read to you some examples I found while quickly researching this. So the following are some examples of information that I've found on various websites. Some of these websites I consider to be good sources of information, some of them I just ran across while Googling. And all of this information is describing stretch needles. So just stretch needles is one example of a type of needle that we're going to talk about. The sewingdirectory.co.uk says, stretch needles are ballpoint needles that are coated to allow them to slip through difficult fabrics. Now, I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I've never seen any reference to stretch needles being coated with anything ever. So either they're the only ones who have noted this, or I don't know. Seamwork.com says, stretch needles are like ballpoint needles, but they have a slightly less rounded point to prevent skipped stitches, which is ideal for activewear, swimwear, and highly elastic knits with a lot of lycra or spandex. Okay? goldstartool.com says, sewing with stretchy fabrics like lycra or spandex is much different from sewing woven fabrics like cotton. A special stretch needle with a slightly rounded tip helps make the job easier. Okay, so that one and the Seamwork one pretty much saying the same thing. That's pretty consistent, which is good. According to SchmetzNeedles.com, manufacturer of sewing machine needles, the Schmetz stretch needle has a medium ball point, a smaller eye, and a deep scarf. Okay, the ballpoint thing is somewhat consistent again, but they definitely went into more detail, and note that at least Schmetz didn't mention any special coatings. CoreFabricStore.com, and here they're referring to the Oregon brand of needles, says, with a ballpoint tip, they are designed to slip between the loops of knit fabrics. I'm going to interrupt for a second. You're definitely seeing that ballpoint is a big part of the stretch needle thing. Continuing, the snake head shape of the needle reduces contact with the fabric, reducing friction and helping to prevent skipped stitches. And on wawak.com, I don't know how you say it, W-A-W-A-K, Wawak? Schmetz Stretch Ballpoint Home Machine Needles feature a rounded ballpoint designed to sew without puncturing or snagging on fabric. So, obviously there's some consistency. Everybody seems to agree that a stretch needle has a ballpoint, although there are also ballpoint needles that are not stretch needles. And apparently there's different styles of ballpoint needles that are more or less ball, more or less round. But everybody agrees that a stretch needle is a ballpoint needle, and then there are other details that either aren't mentioned or are, depending on who's talking. So this video isn't specifically about stretch needles, but I do want to take this opportunity to try to explain to the best I can why it matters, what's different about sewing a stretchy material than a different fabric. So the way a sewing machine works is the needle penetrates the fabric or goes between the threads that make up the fabric, depending on the construction of the fabric. But for the sake of argument, the needle penetrates, carrying with it the top thread. And then as the needle comes back up, it's relying on the friction of the material, of the fabric being sewn, to hold the thread while the needle is retracting, and that creates a loop. There's an error that can happen in this process known as flagging, where instead of the thread being gripped by the fabric as the needle comes up, the fabric rises with the needle as well. And that prevents a loop from being formed underneath it, which is what the bobbin has to catch, or the shuttle has to catch, or I guess the hook has to, whatever, you get the idea. So if there's no loop, you don't get a stitch. That's how you get skipped stitches, or just a failure to stitch altogether. So with a stretchy fabric, there's perhaps a higher likelihood that that flagging is going to occur, because you've got a lighter, stretchier fabric that may tend to want to hang on to the needle and be pulled out of position more so than something without any stretch to it. So my understanding is the ballpoint is to separate the threads and not cut the fabric, which is important just so you don't damage the fabric and weaken the seam, but that the larger scarf, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm going to get to that in a second, but the larger scarf in the needle and perhaps the smaller eye somehow contribute to ensuring that a loop big enough to be caught by the hook still gets formed even if the fabric is hanging onto the needle a little bit. I think that's how it works. There's not a great source that I can find that explains this in any greater detail than that, and I'm piecing things together from different sources. So I guess this is as good a time to say it as any. Two things. This is going to be a long video of me talking, and two, if you think I'm getting something wrong, I encourage you to post a comment below, but please explain what your source of information is or how you know what I'm getting wrong. What I don't want is me saying I'm right and you saying, no, you're not right, I'm right, and neither one of us have anything to back up what we're saying. What I want to find out is what's correct. So if I'm getting this wrong, I've looked into it to the extent that I can, and I'm basing a lot of this on my own experience, but I could be wrong. So if you know better, just please explain how you know what you know. I'd appreciate it. Thanks. So let's talk about what a sewing machine needle is. An excellent resource that I have found, and I think you can get this on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description if I can find one. But this is the Sewing Room Technical Handbook by R.L. Friend. My copy is copywritten 1977. I'm not sure if that's when this was originally written, or if that's a later copyright. It only shows the one, so I think that is. Maybe some of this might be a bit dated, but this is really good information on some of the more technical aspects of sewing and diagnosing sewing problems. So if you can get a copy of this, I recommend it. It's not a very big book either, so it's pretty easy reading. So in this book, it describes the basic functions of a sewing machine needle as follows. 1, to penetrate the material without damaging it and to provide a hole through which the needle thread may pass. 2, to carry the needle thread down through the material and to form a loop in this thread through which the stitch forming element, the hook, can enter at the appropriate time. And it goes on for different kind of machine than we're talking about. So that's what a sewing machine needle does. It penetrates the fabric, brings the top thread down with it, and then forms the loop to be caught by the hook so that a stitch can be formed. So a sewing machine needle is structurally different from a hand sewing needle. The eye of the needle is closer to the tip of the needle, the point of the needle, and it has a groove. It's going to be very hard for me to show this, but there's a groove in the needle for the thread to ride in, and that allows the thread to pass through the fabric. And then there's a scarf, that's this little cutout above the eye, and the purpose of that cutoff is to basically give more room when the thread forms a loop for the hook to catch. There's probably something technically wrong with what I just said, but that's a fair enough description. So that's very generally how a sewing machine needle does what it's supposed to do. Now, here's where things get really confusing. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm only talking about lock stitch sewing machines. I'm not talking about cover stitch, sergers, blind stitch machines. I'm talking about your typical sewing machine. The thing you think of when I say sewing machine. That's what we're talking about. And I also want to just take industrial sewing machines and dispense of them here and now. First and foremost, the important thing you need to know if you are buying or have bought an industrial sewing machine and you're having problems with needles Needle system has nothing to do with needle size, or, well, it can have something to do with the needle style, but if you have a machine that uses a 135 by 17 or 135 x 17, I actually don't even know how it's supposed to be said, but if you have a machine that's 135 x 17 needle system, you need that kind of needle, that style of needle, or your machine will likely not work, or you could break something. That has nothing to do with the size. Those numbers have no bearing at all on the dimensions of the needle. I use that needle system as an example because all of the industrial machines and my Sailrite machines all use that needle system. It's a very common needle system for light to medium industrial sewing machines. Your typical walking foot sewing machines are almost certainly going to use that needle. And there's many other industrial machines that use a different needle system, and it's important that you use the correct needle system. So if you leave here with nothing else, you need to know the needle system, and then you can figure out what size you need or what style you need. I say this about industrial machines. It's true of home machines, but virtually all home machines on the market since forever use one needle system. So I'm getting the following information from the threadexchange.com. No affiliation, but that's where I usually get my thread from, and they're a great resource for information about thread and needles, so I recommend checking them out. So for home sewing needles, the system is called 130/705 or HAX1 or HA by 1, again I don't know if the X is pronounced X or by, or 15X1. So even though it's all the same system, the trend in sewing continues. It has 3 different names. If you're not aware of it, thread sizes are described in several different metrics, different systems, and so are needle sizes, and so are needle systems. So great, it's all more confusing. But so anyway, all for the sake of this discussion, all home sewing machines, domestic sewing machines, should use the same needle system. So when you go to your fabric store, you don't have to look for a particular needle system for your domestic lock stitch sewing machine. Then you're just worried about size and style. But again, if you're using an industrial machine, it matters, so make sure you know what needle system your machine uses. I almost forgot, for industrial needles, this is just a funny example of how confusing this all can be. For that needle system I described, the 135x17, a leather needle for a machine that uses that needle system is a 135x16. The 16 designates that it's a leather needle, and 17 is, I guess, everything else. So yeah, it's very confusing. Okay, so you're going to buy some needles for your domestic or home sewing machine, and you need to know what kind of needles to buy. We've established that they're all the same system, so you don't have to worry about that. So I would argue that the next thing you need to determine is the needle size. How do you do that? So the conventional wisdom, and the wisdom that I follow, is you choose the thread for the fabric and then the needle for the thread. So picked out your fabric for your project, you want to select a thread that is a good fit for the structure of the thing you're making, and will work well with the fabric. So for example, if you are making an ultralight stuff sack out of 1.1 ounce sil nylon, you don't want V138 thread. That's not going to work well at all. You would want to select a thread that's appropriate for the fabric that you're using, and then you want the needle that best suits that thread. So some people might think, well, you want to choose a needle for the fabric. I mean, if you're using the right thread, it sort of works out that you're going to have an appropriately sized needle. There's not one size of needle that works for one size of thread. There's definitely some overlap. So, you may want to choose something on the smaller end of the needle spectrum for the thread you're using if you're using a particularly lightweight fabric, for example. When you're buying your fabric, that's a great time to see if the seller has recommendations for the thread you should be using and then needle size to go with that thread. So once you've decided that you've got the correct size and system and all that stuff, then the question, and really this is kind of the point of this video, is what style of needle should you use? And maybe the underlying question, does it really matter? Okay, I'm going to go into Jason guessing based on his experience territory here. And I need to give a caveat. I've got a pretty broad range of experience sewing, but there's a whole lot of stuff that I've never done that might be more sensitive to needle choice than the things that I have done. So I'm kind of speaking to the people who are maybe starting out or maybe branching into other areas of sewing that they haven't done before. To those people, I say, my opinion is you could probably get away with a universal needle a lot. My guess is that problems that are attributed to not having the correct needle may also or just be attributable to having an inappropriate needle size or an inappropriate thread size or some other issue that may not have anything to do with the needle. One issue with diagnosing sewing problems is a lot of us, myself included, may have a tendency to see that, maybe we're getting skip stitches or, some other issue, and so we will change the needle and adjust the thread tension and oil the machine and rewind the bobbin. And then the problem's solved, but we don't know what solved the problem. It could have been, the bobbin wasn't wound correctly and rewinding it solved the issue, but all that other stuff was for nothing. And now you think, I got to use this needle for this fabric or it won't work. So if you are sewing a material that's new to you and you're experiencing stitch problems, I would urge you to change one thing at a time. And if all you have is universal needles, maybe the first step shouldn't be to go buy stretch needles, for example, but maybe, make some other adjustments first and see if that helps. It could be as simple as just changing to a smaller or a larger needle, depending on what the problems are. So the plural of anecdote is not data. I don't want to talk down to anybody, but I don't want to lose anybody either. What I mean by that is, anecdotes, your personal experience. Your brother owns a sewing shop and has always used this kind of needle and never had a problem, or your cousin owns a sewing shop and always has problems if they don't use this other kind of needle. None of that adds up to actual evidence, but it can inform your experience and stuff. So I'm going to give some anecdotes of my experiences. It's not the same as scientific evidence, but we're not talking about anything that important here. If you find that you use universal needles and it doesn't work, just go buy some other needles. I've sewn a fair amount of stretchy fabrics. I've used spandex or lycra or fabrics containing spandex or lycra as bottle pockets for backpacks and duffel bags, my hydration vest. I've recently started making clothing including this shirt, with stretchier fabrics, which is all new to me. And I've used stretch stitch on these shirts and a couple other shirts. I use zigzag stitches to close, bottle pocket tops to do the hem. And up until recently, I did all of it with universal needles, and maybe some super expert could look at the work I did and say, I can see that you used the wrong needle because of whatever really subtle evidence is there. I don't know. Looks fine to me. But I've also used stretch needles. I bought stretch needles to work on some of the apparel projects I've done recently. I can't tell any difference. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a difference, but at my level as a, maybe advanced hobbyist, at least with this stuff that I'm doing, it's all the same to me. I can't tell. So I don't think it's that big of a deal, except maybe, on the fringes when you get into certain fabrics, or if you're really, expecting absolute perfection and a slight wavering of the stitch line is going to be noticeable to you, then, maybe it would make a difference. I don't know. I've also sewn quite a bit of leather projects, nothing particularly big or thick, but I've sewn with leather quite a bit, and I don't know that I've ever used a leather needle for a project. I think I have some that I've tested with. And again, someone who knows what they're looking at and looking carefully would probably be able to see that the stitch line isn't as attractive as it could be. That part of the point of a leather needle, no pun intended, but part of the point of a leather needle is that makes the hole more attractive. I think a lot of them are kind of diagonal, so you kind of a diagonal hole or a line of diagonal holes. There are different leather needles. There's not just one leather needle, especially in the industrial world. But if you're just, wanting to sew a leather patch onto a bag or make a little wallet or something, if you want to get a leather needle or pack of leather needles, go right ahead. But if you just want to do a project today and all you have is universal needles, it'll probably work just fine. One of the other specialty needle types is for knit fabrics, and I don't have any experience with, like something you would sew a sweater out of or something. So I can't speak to how important it is to use that kind of needle for that kind of fabric, and I'm sure there's a wide variety where, maybe some fabrics are able to tolerate a universal needle and some aren't, but that's just speculation on my part. So here is my opinion based on my experience, which, while varied, doesn't have a lot of exposure to fabrics that may be more sensitive to needle style than what you're sewing with. I think needle size, and by association thread size, is probably more important than needle style. I guess maybe to put it another way, if you get the right needle style for a project but it's too big and using a thread that's too big, you're probably still going to have some issues. And I think if you have the right size needle and thread, you can probably get away with having the wrong needle style. And I mean, for the casual seamster who's just making stuff for fun or, doing gifts for family or whatever. If you have a shop specializing in a very high-end product, then it might be a little bit more important. I think it's often possible to achieve a good enough result with the wrong needle choice, both size and style. If you'll allow the digression, I recently posted some videos of some woodworking projects that I've undertaken. I am not a skilled woodworker, and I'm learning a lot as I go. When I bought my table saw, I was aware that saw blades come in a couple of varieties. There's more than this, but you can have a saw blade that is intended to rip cut, which is when you're cutting along the grain of a board, or cross cut, which is when you're cutting across the grain. And the blade that came with my saw is a combination blade, so it's capable of doing either of those, but not as well as a specialized blade for each operation. I can't tell any difference. If I were making super high-end cabinetry or something, then maybe it would be noticeable to me or others. But I'm just a guy making pieces of wood into smaller pieces of wood so I can put other pieces of wood that I might make stuff out of onto those pieces of wood to store them later. So who cares? It's just a saw blade cutting wood. I think universal needles are very much like that. If you're just sewing some stuff together, it's probably not going to make a difference. If you find that you're having problems that you can attribute to no other cause than the wrong style of needle, then maybe you need to use a different style of needle. But I think those cases are going to be on the fringes. And again, because I can't emphasize it enough, I am speaking to the sewing generalist, sewing for a hobby, maybe branching out into other things. I just think, if you want to buy some stretch needles to sew your stretch fabric with, or whatever, I keep saying stretch because it's the one that comes to mind. But if you want to buy a specialty needle for your fabric, go right ahead. All I want to get across is, if you've bought some fabric, didn't think about buying needles, don't stand frozen looking at your sewing machine and think, well, I can't do it. I don't have a stretch needle and I've got some stretchy fabric. Try it. You'd probably be okay with the correct sized universal needle and an appropriate thread, and maybe some stitches won't work as well or whatever, but if you're just sewing stuff together, you should probably be fine. And if you're not, then order some stretch needles. I'll have some links in the description to sites that I used as resources and anything else I can think of that will be useful. This is a topic that is very difficult to cover thoroughly. I really, if there's a comprehensive source of information about like every type of sewing needle and why you would need to use it and when you don't need to use it, I don't know where it is. So this is the best I can do at the moment. If you have questions, please ask them in the comment section, and I'll do my best to either answer them or tell you that I don't know. Obviously, any comments you want down there. Clicking like is always a big help. If you are not a subscriber to my channel, I would love it if you'd join us, and I appreciate you watching. See you in the next video. Oh, manatee right here.
Oh my god! Yes! Yes! Oh my god, really? Yes. Oh my god.
So that just happened. Literally as I was walking up to the board, it just exploded. I'm guessing that it sitting in the sun made the air expand in it and was too much for it, but I mean, we were here for like half an hour. It's not that hot. Oh well, RIP inflatable. I think I'm sticking to my solid board from now on.